The massive space station floated silently in the darkness between stars. Concordia Prime was the most beautiful structure humanity had ever seen, built from materials that sparkled like diamonds and curved like flowing water. For 50 years, this had been where Earth's representatives came to sit at the big table with all the other species in the galaxy. Kim Min-ho walked through the long corridors, his black diplomatic uniform pressed and perfect. He had been doing this job for 15 years now, and every single day felt the same. The other species would talk, they would make decisions, and humanity would politely agree or politely disagree, and nobody would care much either way. Today felt different, though. Minho could sense it in the way the other diplomats avoided looking at him. The Zephyrians, with their gray-scaled skin and yellow eyes, whispered among themselves in their harsh language. The Nexari floated in their glass tanks, their tentacles moving in patterns that meant they were calculating something. Even the energy beings called Luminari seemed more focused than usual, their bright forms pulsing with what Minho had learned to recognize as excitement. The council chamber was enormous, with seats arranged in circles that went up and up toward the ceiling. Earth's seat was small and placed near the back. Minho took his place and waited. High Commander Thaxvel entered the chamber like he owned it. The Zephyrian leader was 8 feet tall and covered in scars from old battles. His people were warriors who had conquered half their galaxy before joining the Confederation. They respected strength and despised weakness, and they had made it very clear what they thought about humans. The Council will address the matter of Sector 7, Thaxvel announced, his voice echoing through the chamber. The Zephyrian Empire claims the right to expand into these territories. Minho felt his stomach drop. Sector 7 included New Aberdeen, one of humanity's farming worlds. 2 million people lived there, growing food and raising their children in peace. It was exactly the kind of place the Zephyrians like to target. The Neutral Zone Accords clearly state that those territories cannot be claimed by any member species, Minho said, standing up. His voice sounded small in the huge chamber. Thaxvel turned to look at him, and Minho could see amusement in those yellow eyes. The human delegate speaks of laws and accords. How predictable. Several other species made sounds that Minho recognized as laughter. The Keth, who looked like giant insects, clicked their mandibles together. The Nexari's tentacles swirled faster in their tanks. Your species has changed so much, Thaxvel continued, walking closer to Earth's section. Once humans were interesting. You conquered your own world through violence and cunning. You built weapons that could destroy entire planets. You were savage and dangerous and worthy of respect. Minho kept his face calm, but inside he was burning with anger. This was the same speech they always gave. Humans were weak now. Humans were soft. Humans had forgotten how to fight. But look at you now, the Zephyrian commander laughed. You spend your time making music and writing poetry. You talk about art and philosophy and feelings. You call this being civilized, but really you have just forgotten what you used to be. The savage humans are gone, and in their place we have this. He gestured at Minho with one clawed hand, and the gesture was full of contempt. The other species representatives watched with interest like they were seeing an entertaining show. We formally object to any expansion into Sector 7, Minho said quietly. Those worlds are protected under... Protected by whom? Thaxvel interrupted. By your tiny fleet of research vessels? By your mining ships and cargo haulers? You have no real military human. You gave up the right to object to anything the day you decided to become poets instead of warriors. The chamber filled with more alien laughter. Minho stood there and took it just like he had been trained to do. Stay calm. Be diplomatic. Don't make things worse. The matter is settled, Thaxvel declared. Zephyrian forces will begin operations in Sector 7 within the month. Any interference will be considered an act of war against a superior species. The session ended with the usual bureaucratic procedures. Documents were filed. Votes were taken that everyone knew didn't matter. The other species filed out of the chamber, chatting among themselves about trade deals and mining rights. Minho gathered his papers slowly, waiting until he was alone. Then he walked back to his quarters. through corridors that suddenly felt less like a diplomatic station and more like a prison. In his private room, he activated a communication device that looked like a standard diplomatic tablet but was actually something much more sophisticated. The screen showed a woman in a military uniform, sitting in what appeared to be an office on Earth. "Admiral Lee Ji-won," Minho said quietly. "I watched the session," she replied. Her voice was calm, but Minho could see something dangerous in her eyes. "They're going to hit New Aberdeen. They think we're helpless," Minho said. "They think we forgot how to fight." Admiral Lee was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "It's time to remind them," she said. "Activate Protocol 7. The morning sun was just rising over New Aberdeen when Park Sun-ho heard the first rumble in the sky. He was checking the irrigation systems in his family's grain fields, the same work he had done every morning for the past 12 years. His wife Yuna was inside making breakfast for their twin daughters, and everything felt perfectly normal until the sky started to darken. At first, Sun-ho thought it might be a storm. The weather on New Aberdeen could change quickly, and dark clouds often rolled in from the eastern mountains. But as he looked up, shading his eyes with his hand, he realized the darkness was moving wrong. It was too organized, too purposeful. The first Zephyrian battleship broke through the atmosphere like a falling mountain. It was massive, easily a mile long, with a hull that looked like it was made from black metal and sharp angles. Behind it came another ship, then another, until the entire sky was filled with them. Sun-ho dropped his tools and ran toward the house. "Yuna," he shouted, "get the girls. We need to go now." But it was already too late. The attack began before he reached the front door. The Zephyrians had not come to conquer New Aberdeen. They had come to make an example. The first wave of bombs fell on the orbital defense platforms, wiping them out in seconds. The second wave hit the major cities. The third wave targeted the farming communities like Sun-ho's. The ground shook so hard that Sun-ho was thrown to his knees. He looked back and saw his grain fields disappearing in a wall of fire and smoke. The irrigation system he had been checking moments before was now a crater 50 feet deep. Yuna emerged from the house carrying their daughters, both girls crying and holding on to their mother. "The car!" she shouted over the noise. They ran to their vehicle, but before they could reach it, another explosion lifted it into the air and scattered the pieces across their yard. Sun-ho grabbed his family and pulled them toward the emergency shelter that every farming community was required to have. The shelter was underground, built to protect against natural disasters. It had never been designed to withstand military bombardment. As they huddled inside with their neighbors, listening to the sounds of destruction above, Sun-ho wondered if they would ever see daylight again. The bombardment lasted 6 hours. When it finally stopped, the silence was almost worse than the noise had been. Sun-ho was the first to climb out of the shelter. What he saw made his legs weak. The rolling green fields that had covered the valley were gone, replaced by smoking craters and twisted metal. The small town where his daughters went to school was completely destroyed. The community center where his family attended social gatherings was nothing but rubble. Zephyrian soldiers were everywhere, their gray uniforms and energy weapons making it clear that resistance was pointless. They moved efficiently through the ruins, separating survivors into groups. Families were divided without explanation. Children were taken from their parents. A Zephyrian officer approached Sun-ho's group of survivors. Unlike the soldiers, this one spoke an accented but understandable human language. "You will come with us," the officer said. "Do not resist. Do not run. Compliance will make this easier for everyone." Sun-ho felt Yuna's hand squeeze his arm. Their daughters pressed against them, too scared to cry anymore. He wanted to fight. Every instinct told him to protect his family, but the energy weapons pointed at them made it clear that heroics would only get them killed. They were loaded onto transport ships along with hundreds of other survivors. Through the small windows, Sun-ho could see the remains of New Aberdeen, shrinking below them. Everything he had worked for, everything his family had built, was gone. The transport took them to a detention facility on one of New Aberdeen's moons. It was clean and efficient with basic food and shelter, but it was still a prison. The Zephyrians made it clear that the survivors were being kept alive for a reason. "You are proof," the camp commander explained during their first day. "Proof that humans cannot protect themselves. Proof that your species has forgotten how to fight. Your suffering will be broadcast across the galaxy so that everyone can see what happens to the weak." And they did broadcast it. Every day, cameras recorded the survivors in their detention facilities. The galaxy watched as families were separated, as proud farmers and teachers and doctors were reduced to helpless prisoners. The message was clear: this is what happens when you challenge the strong. But something strange happened as the broadcasts continued. While the galaxy watched humans suffer, something else was happening in the background. Communications from Earth suddenly stopped. Human trade ships disappeared from space lanes. The music and entertainment that many species had grown used to simply vanished. At first, other species thought this was just human grief. They assumed Earth was mourning its losses and would eventually return to normal. But days turned into weeks, and the silence continued. In the detention facility, Sunho noticed something that the Zephyrians had missed. The guards were becoming nervous. They talked among themselves in hushed voices, and their confidence was slowly being replaced by something that looked like worry. "What's happening out there?" Yuna asked one evening as they held their daughters close. Sunho looked up at the stars visible through their small window. Somewhere out there, Earth was silent. Somewhere out there, decisions were being made that would change everything. "I think," he said quietly, "we're about to find out what humanity is really capable of." The silence from human space was becoming uncomfortable. On the Nexari homeworld, trade officials stared at empty shipping schedules where human cargo vessels should have been. The humans had always been reliable, always on time, always ready to negotiate. Now their communication channels were dead. Katir, the entertainment world of Kepler-7. Millions of alien citizens waited for the new human music that usually arrived every week. Human songs had become incredibly popular across the galaxy. Their emotional melodies and complex rhythms were unlike anything other species created. But the music had stopped coming 3 weeks ago. High Commander Thax Fell was not worried about music or trade schedules. He was studying military reports in his command center, trying to understand what the humans were planning. The expected response to New Aberdeen should have been angry messages, formal protests, maybe some economic sanctions. Instead, there was nothing. "Perhaps they are simply afraid," suggested his aide, a younger Zephyrian named Kextal. "Perhaps they finally understand their place in the galaxy." Thax Vel was not convinced. In his experience, silent enemies were often the most dangerous ones. On Earth, deep beneath the city of Seoul, Dr. Choi Daeho walked through corridors that most humans did not know existed. The Seoul Archives were officially a research facility where scientists studied alien cultures and technologies. But Dr. Choi knew the truth. They had been studying how to destroy those cultures if necessary. "Professor?" called a voice behind him. Dr. Choi turned to see his assistant, a young woman named Kim Sora, running to catch up with him. "The council meeting is about to begin." Dr. Choi nodded and continued walking. For 50 years, he had been humanity's leading expert on alien warfare. He had read every military document the Confederation species had ever produced. He knew their tactics, their weapons, their strategies. More importantly, he knew their weaknesses. The council chamber was much smaller than the one on Concordia Prime, but the people gathered here held more real power than all the diplomats in the galaxy. Admiral Lee Jiwan sat at the head of the table, her weathered face showing no emotion as she studied holographic displays. "Status report," she said simply. "All human vessels have been recalled from alien space," reported Captain Young Haeun. "Trade routes are closed. Communication blackout is complete." "Cultural exports?" asked the Admiral. "Terminated. Every species that was receiving human entertainment, music, or literature has been cut off. They're starting to ask questions. Doctor." Choi activated his presentation. The hologram showed detailed maps of alien territories, military installations, and economic centers. For 50 years, he began, we have allowed them to believe we were learning from them. We attended their universities, studied their histories, participated in their cultural exchanges. They thought they were civilizing us. The maps zoomed in to show incredible detail. The exact location of Zephyrian weapon factories, the communication networks that connected Nexari colonies, the trade routes that kept the Keth economy functioning. In reality, we were dissecting them. Every conversation, every shared meal, every friendship was an intelligence-gathering operation. We know more about their capabilities than they know about each other. Admiral Lee leaned forward. Their weaknesses? Extensive, Dr. Choi replied. The hologram changed to show economic data. The Zephyrians depend on imported food from 12 different worlds. Cut those supply lines, and their military becomes focused on feeding their population instead of fighting wars. More data appeared. The Nexari collective consciousness requires constant communication between their colonies. Disrupt those signals, and their decision-making process collapses. The Keth built their entire economy on being the galaxy's trade coordinators. Remove them from the equation, and interstellar commerce stops functioning. Captain Young raised her hand. What about their military forces? Dr. Choi smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. They're designed to fight each other. The Zephyrians expect honor-based combat. The Nexari rely on overwhelming numbers. The Keth use economic pressure instead of direct confrontation. None of them are prepared for what we're planning. Which is? Asked Admiral Lee. We don't attack. Their militaries, Dr. Choi explained. We attack their societies, their economies, their ability to maintain civilization. We make them choose between fighting us and keeping their own worlds from falling apart. The room was quiet as everyone processed this information. Finally, Admiral Lee spoke. How long have we been preparing for this? Since the day we joined the Confederation, Dr. Choi replied. Every research station we built had hidden military capabilities. Every trade agreement included contingency plans for economic warfare. Every cultural exchange was designed to gather intelligence. Captain Young looked skeptical. They'll call us barbarians. They'll say we betrayed the principles of civilization. Let them, said Admiral Lee. They called us civilized when it suited them to keep us weak. They forgot that civilization is a choice, not a permanent condition. She stood up and walked to the holographic display showing New Aberdeen. The detention facilities were clearly visible, along with the 2 million human prisoners being held there. They wanted to remind the galaxy what happens to the weak, she said quietly. It's time to remind them what happens when you mistake choosing peace for being unable to choose war. Dr. Choi began distributing sealed orders to the people around the table. Each envelope contained detailed instructions for operations that had been planned for decades but never implemented. Phase 1 begins tomorrow, Admiral Lee announced. By the time we're finished, they'll understand the difference between a species that can't fight and one that simply chooses not to. The awakening had begun. The first sign of trouble came at exactly midnight, Galactic Standard Time, across 17 different star systems simultaneously. On the Zephyrian homeworld, every public screen suddenly began showing something that made government officials panic. Private communications between their own leaders. High Commander Thax Vel was in his private quarters when his aide burst through the door without permission. Sir, you need to see this immediately. Thax Vel followed him to the command center, where dozens of officers were staring at screens in horror. Playing on every public broadcast channel were recordings of secret meetings between Zephyrian commanders. In one video, Thax Vel himself was clearly visible discussing plans to enslave human populations for manual labor. In another, military leaders laughed about bombing civilian targets on New Aberdeen. How did they get these recordings? Thax Vel demanded. These meetings were held in secure locations. Nobody had an answer. The recordings were perfect, showing conversations that had happened in supposedly private rooms with no recording devices present. But somehow humans had captured every word. On the Nexari homeworld, the situation was even worse. The Nexari collective consciousness depended on constant communication between billions of individuals across hundreds of worlds. Suddenly, those communication networks were flooded with false information. Contradictory orders appeared to come from legitimate sources. Economic data was altered in real time. The collective mind that had functioned smoothly for thousands of years began to make mistakes. Trade coordinator Vex Prime floated in his tank, tentacles writhing in confusion as he tried to process the chaos. "The humans," he said to his assistants. "How are they doing this? Our networks are protected by encryption that should take centuries to break." What Vex Prime didn't know was that humans had been inside those networks for 50 years. Every piece of Nexari technology that humans had ever examined, every cultural exchange that had allowed human scientists to study Nexari computers, had been preparation for this moment. The Keth discovered their problems when their massive trade empire simply stopped functioning. Ships carrying essential supplies suddenly changed course. Banking systems transferred funds to accounts that didn't exist. Contracts that had been in place for decades were mysteriously cancelled. Queen Administrator Click Thess stood in her command hive, watching as reports poured in from across Keth space. "Our entire economy is collapsing," she clicked to her advisors. "Every trade route, every business agreement, every financial transaction is being disrupted." "The humans?" suggested one of her advisors. "Impossible," Click Thess replied. "They don't have the capability for this kind of economic warfare. They're farmers and artists, not financial experts." But they were wrong. For 50 years, human economists had been studying galactic trade patterns. They knew exactly which transactions were critical, which supply lines were essential, and which economic relationships kept entire civilizations functioning. Now they were using that knowledge like a weapon. Commander Yoon Seola stood on the bridge of what the galaxy had always believed was a simple human cargo ship. In reality, the vessel was packed with communication equipment, computer systems, and some of the most advanced technology humanity had ever built. Around her, dozens of technicians worked at stations, coordinating the largest information warfare operation in galactic history. "Status report," she ordered. "Zephyrian government communications are in complete chaos," reported one technician. "Their military commanders can't coordinate operations because they don't know which orders are real." "Nexari Collective is fragmenting," called another. "False data has corrupted their decision-making process. They're sending contradictory instructions to their own colonies." "Keth trade networks have collapsed," added a third. "Their economy is losing billions of credits every hour." Yoon Seola activated the ship's main communication system. Her message would be broadcast to every inhabited world in the galaxy, impossible to block or jam. "Citizens of the Galactic Confederation," she began, her voice calm and professional. "This is Commander Yoon Seola of the Human Defense Fleet. For 50 years you have called us civilized. You praised us for abandoning our capacity for war in favor of art, music, and peaceful cooperation. On thousands of worlds, billions of beings stopped what they were doing to listen. You were wrong," Yoon continued. "We did not abandon our capacity for war. We perfected it. While you built bigger weapons and stronger armies, we learned to fight battles you didn't even know were happening." The broadcast showed footage of human activities over the past 50 years, cultural exchanges, trade negotiations, diplomatic meetings. But now the footage was annotated, showing the real purpose behind each interaction. "Every song we shared taught us about your psychology. Every trade agreement revealed your economic weaknesses. Every diplomatic conversation was an intelligence-gathering operation. You thought you were civilizing us. In reality, we were studying you." High Commander Thax Vel watched the broadcast from his command center, finally understanding what had happened. "They played us," he said quietly. "For 50 years, they played us." "What do we do?" asked his aide. Thax Vel looked at the chaos surrounding them, communications down, supply lines cut, economic systems collapsing. "We surrender," he said. "We surrender before they decide to show us what they're really capable of." The storm had been unleashed, and the galaxy would never be the same. The humans had won their war without firing a single shot, proving that the most dangerous weapon was not the one that could destroy bodies, but the one that could destroy the systems that held civilizations together. In her detention facility, on New Aberdeen's moon, Una squeezed her husband's hand as they watched the broadcast. "Is it over?" she whispered. Sunho looked at his daughters, who were smiling for the first time in weeks. "I think," he said, "it's just beginning." 6 months after the storm, Park Sunho stood in his rebuilt grain fields, watching his daughters play among the green shoots that had grown from new seeds. The detention camps were gone, torn down by the same Zephyrian soldiers who had built them. Every survivor of New Aberdeen had been returned home with resources to rebuild everything they had lost. But the most important change was not in the fields or the new houses. It was in the way the Zephyrian workers looked at him when they delivered construction supplies. There was no contempt in their eyes anymore, only respect and perhaps a little fear. The memorial stood at the center of the rebuilt town, a simple black stone wall with the names of everyone who had died in the attack. Below the names, carved in letters that could be seen from space, were the words that had become humanity's new motto. "Here lies the last mistake made by those who confused humanity's choice to be civilized with an inability to be otherwise." Kim Minho no longer needed the title of ambassador. His new position was Director of Galactic Relations, and when he spoke, the entire galaxy listened. The meeting chamber on Concordia Prime had been redesigned. Earth's seat was now at the center of the room, and every other species had to look up to see the human representative. "The Reformation Accords are simple," Minho explained to the assembled delegates. His voice was calm, but everyone in the room understood the power behind his words. "Every species in the Confederation will have equal representation. No more junior members. No more dismissing smaller civilizations because they choose peace over aggression." The Zephyrian representative, a much younger and more humble commander than Thax Vel, raised his hand carefully. "What happened to our former leaders?" "They are alive and well," Minho replied. "They are working in agricultural rehabilitation centers, learning to grow food instead of destroying it. We believe in redemption, not revenge." This was the new reality. The humans had not created an empire or demanded tribute. They had not enslaved their former enemies or destroyed their worlds. Instead, they had implemented something far more sophisticated, a system where every species was truly equal, where decisions were made through genuine cooperation rather than fear. Captain Jung Heun oversaw the final stages of New Aberdeen's reconstruction. Her ship, no longer disguised as a simple cargo vessel, orbited the planet with its sensors monitoring the entire system. But the weapons that had torn apart the Galactic Order 6 months ago were now silent. "The last transport is leaving," reported her communications officer. "All Zephyrian military personnel have been evacuated from the system." Jung nodded. The Zephyrians had been surprisingly cooperative once they understood their new position in the galaxy. Fear was a powerful motivator, but humans had learned something more important. Respect was longer lasting. On Earth, Dr. Choi Daeho had returned to his research, but his work now carried a different weight. The intelligence networks that had taken 50 years to build were being converted into educational systems. Instead of gathering information for warfare, they now shared knowledge to prevent future conflicts. The key, he explained to his students, was understanding that every civilization has two faces, the one they show to friends and the one they show to enemies. For 50 years, we made sure they only saw us as friends. One of his students, a young man named Lee Taman, raised his hand. "Professor, what if they try to rebuild their military forces? What if they want revenge?" Dr. Choi smiled, the same expression that had terrified alien military planners 6 months earlier. "Let them try. We spent 50 years learning their weaknesses. Now we spend 50 years making sure those weaknesses remain." The truth was that the galaxy had been fundamentally changed. The economic systems that humans had dismantled were slowly being rebuilt, but under human oversight. The communication networks that had been corrupted were being restored, but with human-designed security. The trade routes that had collapsed were reopening, but following human-approved patterns. It was not conquest in the traditional sense. It was something more subtle and more permanent, the creation of a new order where humanity's interests were woven into the very fabric of galactic civilization. Admiral Lee Ji-won stood in her office looking out at the stars through a massive window. Reports covered her desk, status updates from across human space, intelligence briefings from the former Confederation worlds, proposals for new technologies and cultural exchanges. "Admiral," said her aide, entering with another stack of documents. "The monthly report from the Nexari territories." Lee took the report and scanned it quickly. Production was up, crime was down, and most importantly, there had been no incidents of anti-human sentiment. The Nexari, like all the former Confederation species, were learning to live in the new galaxy. "Any word from the outer systems?" Lee asked. "Some minor species are requesting to join the new Confederation. They've heard about our policies of genuine equality and want protection from the remaining aggressive civilizations." Lee nodded. This was exactly what they had hoped for. Instead of ruling through fear, humanity was becoming the center of a new galactic community built on mutual respect and genuine cooperation. The irony was not lost on her. The species that had called humans civilized while treating them as inferiors were now discovering what true civilization actually meant. It was not the absence of the ability to fight, but the wisdom to know when fighting served justice and when it merely enabled oppression. The new order had begun, and this time it would last.